special guest with us, Becca Heller. She is the co-founder of the International Refugee Assistance Project, which has helped bring thousands of Iraqis, Afghans, and others to the U.S. through the Special Immigrant Visa Program. As a leading advocate for refugee rights, Becca has won many awards, including the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship. She is currently a senior research scholar at Yale Law School and a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she's going to talk to us today about making new friends, broadening immigration advocacy beyond immigration. So welcome, Becca. Thank you for being here.
I'm not going to read the agenda to you guys. Hi, thanks for having me. The good news is I wrote this fresh for you guys yesterday, and the bad news is it means I'm going to be reading it and not going to make a lot of eye contact, so hopefully it'll be somewhat compelling regardless. 2 days after Trump was reelected last November, I had a proxy fight with a mystery editor at the New York Times. I had been in a deep depression for about 48 hours, even though I had at least 50% expected the outcome, especially insofar as with two candidates, each one in a vacuum has a 50-50 chance of winning. A New York Times writer reached out to me because they were doing a story about how immigration lawyers were planning to fight back. She was reaching out to lawyers who had, quote, fought back in Trump 1.0 to hear about our plans for Trump 2.0. I was reluctant to say that given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, the hashtag resistance fatigue around the country, and the pulling back on immigration from a lot of major philanthropists, I was not that optimistic about our chances because that didn't seem like a helpful framing. So I dutifully talked about how Project 2025 had essentially laid all their plans bare for us, given us a document to prepare off of, and that we had been planning for months. The months of planning, of course, was true. The conclusion of that was just that we didn't have a lot of moves. An hour after giving the initial interview, I was on the subway back to Brooklyn, and I got a series of apparently very urgent texts from this reporter. I got off at DeKalb and called her back from the subway station. The editors are asking me, she said, for you to comment on the fact that he has a major mandate to do mass deportations. This irked me, and I tried a few different tacks. First, I tried, well, yes, a majority of the vote is not actually a mandate to violate the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. Rights exist so that a simple majority of the voting population can't authorize taking them away. That sounds like an answer only a bunch of lawyers would care about, she said. Well, I tried again. I hope we're not so far down the rabbit hole that no one cares about civil or human rights anymore. And I certainly don't think those are hyper-technical things that only lawyers care about. We had some more unproductive back and forth along these lines. She kept pressing me on the, quote, huge mandate New York Times reporters apparently wanted me to acknowledge. I'm not sure I think 51% of the popular vote is a huge mandate, I finally said. The editors aren't going to run a quote from you if you won't acknowledge that the majority of Americans voted for mass deportation, she said. I said I didn't care that much about a quote, and we ended the call. They ran my quote anyway. This call struck me for a few reasons. First, while I started the call in a deep depression, I ended it angry. The New York Times was not a pro-Trump publication. It was arguably an anti-Trump publication. And even they were hardcore leading into a narrative that winning 51% of the popular vote after spending literally $1 billion telling Americans that their groceries were expensive because of immigrants was somehow a huge mandate to mass deport people. It felt like we were already caving on so much and only 48 hours in. That pissed me off. And it felt much better to be righteously pissed off than nihilistically and hopelessly sad. But more than that, it was a major harbinger of what was to come. The conflation of overall approval for Trump with overall approval for the most extreme versions of his immigration policies, even by the gray lady of record. A popular myth amongst Democratic Party elites and a good slice of the donor class is that Democrats lost the 2024 election to Trump because of immigration. There are a lot of really fun hot takes out there saying that Biden was too generous on immigration, and that led to chaos at the southern border, and that allowed Trump to win. My hot take is that Democrats lost to Trump because they didn't do that whole primary thing, where you run a bunch of people against each other and you pick the most competitive one to be your candidate. They actually didn't do the whole primary thing twice. And both of the candidates they ran didn't try to advance any kind of affirmative vision of immigration, or even try to counter Trump's dire portrait of migrant caravans and criminals and border chaos. Biden said, literally, nothing. In fact, during his entire presidency, he never tried to use his bully pulpit to explain or defend or articulate a vision for his immigration policy. Harris mostly said nothing, but she did take the time to point out that she had a long career as a prosecutor, and that would help her be tough on the border, which I would also argue is not an immigration policy vision. So on the one side, there was Trump and the $1 billion in comms spending and countless more in earned media, pushing the narrative that immigrants were responsible for all of America's ills and the only solution was to crack down. And on the other side, there was silence. This is not a winning strategy. And yet the lesson that a lot of party operatives and donors have taken is that it's best not to talk about immigration because it is a losing issue. The polling does not bear this out. More in Common engaged Americans in its nationally online representative panel, Americans in Conversations, in October 25. They talked to 131 participants with a roughly even mix of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. The survey tested messages on immigration enforcement and the border geared toward the right, the center, and the left. Most Americans gravitated to a message in the center, and the survey had some interesting specific findings, and it's not out yet, so you're hearing about them here first. 1, Americans want order and humanity in our immigration system. 2, Democrats overwhelmingly expressed dissatisfaction with their party on immigration, largely because of their silence on the issue over the years. Many want the party to emphasize stricter border security, but in a more humane way than the current administration's tactics. 3, Independents express a desire for Democrats to be more stringent and for Republicans to be less cruel, encapsulating the balancer attitude of weighing both control and compassion. 4, on border security, most Americans across all parties support a both-and approach. The responses support both stronger border control, but also expanding the routes for legal immigration. On pathways to citizenship, both Democrats and independents overwhelmingly favor a moderate message. Most consistently distinguish between long-term undocumented immigrants and recent arrivals, arguing that the deportation of the former would be far more disruptive to American economic and social life. 6, on detention policy, independents are most supportive of a moderate approach. While both independents and Democrats indicated a distaste for detention overall, more independents see it as necessary. And 7, on public safety. Oops, I just tripped. Both Democrats and independents express strong support for a moderate approach, but disagree with the recent deployments of the National Guard. The most recent large-scale national polling I could find was from Gallup this past Saturday. They found that a majority of Americans, 53%, disapprove of how ICE is conducting deportations, and only 39% approve. 62% of those polled think that ICE is arresting people who have not violated any criminal or immigration laws. So there is clearly a large realization that these arrests have no lawful basis, not to mention that they are not, in fact, focusing on so-called violent criminals. The numbers get worse for Trump when you look at Latino voters specifically. Recognizing that Latino voters are not a monolith, but that they get polled as one, a lot of hot takes of 2024 argued that part of what propelled Trump to victory was a massive increase in support amongst Latino voters who were anxious about the economy. A recent CNN poll found that in the year since the election, Trump's support amongst Latino voters has dropped a staggering 30%, from 50% to 20% approval. Some of this is about decreasing confidence in his ability to handle the economy, but a lot of this is about his barbarian immigration policies. 79% of Latino voters told CNN, quote, "Trump has gone too far on immigration." What do we take from all of this? It seems pretty clear that, counter to the New York Times editorial board, Trump does not, in fact, have a mandate to mass deport people to Eswatini and South Sudan. And yet the myth of Trump's popular immigration policies persists, and most Republicans and Democrats are too afraid to say anything to the contrary. So what do we do? I've never been a big fan of narrative change strategies. First of all, I never understood what a narrative change was. Whose narrative? What change? If you can't tie it to a particular policy outcome, what is even the point? This is why everybody hates lawyers. But it turns out I was wrong. Trump is able to carry out his reign of terror against immigrants because of how badly the rest of us have lost the narrative. And this is a really hard thing to fight when philanthropic money for strategic communications is withering and Trump has a singular talent for using the bully pulpit to get earned media. The immigration movement, such as it is, and define it however you want, I'm not going to die on that hill, does not have resources to counter this. We especially don't have the resources to counter this when we're spending every waking hour on habeas petitions and other life and death harm mitigation efforts. So we need to make some new friends. We need to make friends in other advocacy and empowered civil society spaces who have not been traditionally focused on immigration, but who do have serious skin in the game. This includes groups we may feel relatively values aligned with overall, such as unions. But it also includes groups where we may disagree on a lot of things, but can agree that mass deportation is terrible, such as chambers of commerce. There is a meaningful opportunity to engage with veterans on immigration issues, both on the obligations we owe our allies in foreign wars to whom we have promised visas, but also on whether it is an honorable use of the National Guard to deploy them against U.S. residents on U.S. soil to protect ICE agents. There is a meaningful opportunity to engage senior citizens and aging care groups around the massive imbalance between aging baby boomers in need of home care and the ever-decreasing number of workers in the U.S. able to provide that home care. There is a meaningful opportunity to engage schools, educational associations, and parents groups around how highly disruptive the mass deportation regime has been to everyone's education. I have also been dying on the hill that we who oppose mass deportation should be playing offense on public safety. Almost all of the stated rationales for Trump policies are public safety focused. But if the majority of the public doesn't believe that Trump is actually targeting violent criminals or even lawbreakers, this rationale is already on very shaky ground. Add to this that 25% of FBI agents have been reassigned to focus on mass deportations. I had to Google this, but it turns out that's over 9,000 FBI agents. What were those 9,000 agents working on before that they are no longer doing? The New York Times yesterday, and well timed for this talk, had an incredible front page story on all the things that the Department of Homeland Security is no longer doing in order to focus on deportations, ranging from chasing child sex predators to engaging in meaningful intelligence gathering around counterterrorism. There are pretty good arguments that mass deportations are making us all materially less safe. Are there friends who might want to make these arguments with us? I posit that we can't be ideological purists in our pursuit of allies to fight against Trump's immigrant pogrom. And I debated whether to use that word, and I went for it. And I feel confident about it, and I'm happy to defend it in the Q&A. It helps to, I feel like being Jewish, I have license to use the word a little freer. This will continue to isolate us, and it will keep us on the wildly losing end of resource and power distributions. We have to be willing to work with people we might not agree with on all issues, or even on all immigration issues. But maybe we can agree that workplace raids are bad and join forces to fight against workplace raids, even if we don't agree with the way that those workplaces treat their workers. Maybe we can agree that it is not an appropriate use of the military to deploy thousands of troops against our own cities, even if we don't agree on what else those troops should be doing. Maybe we can agree that immigration is crucial to the American workforce, especially given demographic shift, even if we don't agree with specific narrative choices around things like essential workers. This doesn't mean we have to endorse positions or narratives that we disagree with, but it means that if we can't at least tolerate opposing views, we will all continue to be wildly outgunned. Our task moving forward is to fill the silence left by the Democratic Party on the issue of immigration. It is to provide a viable counter-narrative to Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric and policies. It is to suggest policies that are both humane and grounded in messages of public safety and economic growth. One thing helping us is that objectively, we're correct. Mass deportation and persecution is terrible by just about any measure, any way you slice it. But if a tree is correct in the middle of the forest and no one is there to hear it, it makes less sound than Joe Biden on immigration. We need to make more noise. We need to activate more voices, and we need to make new friends. Thank you.
We do have time for a couple questions. So.
Sorry, I went super political. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Becca. Justin Guest. I loved a lot of what you said. I think that the challenge for me comes from the universal polling, because the problem with our institutions is that there's only one.
Which institutions? Sorry.
Our electoral institution
Got it, okay.
is that there's only one person in the entire country who is elected across the entire country, and even he is elected according to the Electoral College. And so when we have 70% majority believing in something that's pro-immigration, a 57% majority, the leaders, the people who actually have, are in the position to have the spine to actually stand up for these matters, are not subject to that 57% majority. They're subject to a very specific group of primary voters that they're concerned are not going to support them in the next election. And I wonder, have you thought about how to actually work with inside of those institutions to actually connect and resonate with elected officials given their electoral conditions?
Yes, although I don't know if this conference has a C4, so I don't know how much they want me to get into detail on the answer to that question. I mean, I think, sure, in my personal capacity, I think there's obviously a dearth of district level polling on this, but I think that when you do it, it cuts pretty favorably in a pro-immigrant way. So I think the issue is not that there isn't kind of district level support in a lot of these places. And I suspect that in some border district in Texas, for example, things might play out really interestingly around the primary base in a way that they might not, more in the interior. But I think this has to be the project of showing Republican or Democratic politicians first that people want you to have an actual vision for immigration. It is not enough to just be quiet or to say we don't like Trump's vision. An argument I've had with a lot of people in our field is you can only run a campaign of no for so long before you have to say yes to something. And I think the threshold there is just going to be your constituents prefer something to silence, and then saying what do you need? What messaging do you need? What policies do you need? And recognizing that we're no longer in the comprehensive immigration reform era. So you don't need to give them here is how we fix all of immigration policy in a world where somehow we regain a trifecta of power, but it can just be in your district, meat packing is a really big deal and you don't have enough people and that's bad. Here is a ideally non-abusive way with portability built in to fulfill those, right? But so doing locally specific messaging. And I think also, I know I missed the panel earlier, but that you spoke about the importance of who the messenger is. And I think the other really important thing is who goes to those folks. It should not be me. But figuring out sort of who from the unions or who from the vets or who from the AARP can bring that message and then getting them what they need to do so, I think can be a very effective strategy and is something that several people are already working on. So hit me up if this feels interesting to you. I guess that's the call to action. It's sort of a lame call to action, but it's a real one.
I had one question.
Yes.
It's about old friends.
Perfect.
Give your advice on how faith-based organizations fit into this puzzle and as leaders in fighting against these mass deportations. And you can comment on what you've seen to date and what you think you should see in the future from the faith-based organizations.
I mean, I'm pretty happy with the Catholics right now. And I'm not pandering. So there was a fun article yesterday about how the Pope doesn't want to be the anti-Trump, but he is. And I was just oh, I don't want to be, I feel that would give me anxiety if I were him, but I guess he wanted a big job, so he has it. I think what's tricky on faith, so I come from the refugee space, and there's a lot of sort of faith-based involvement in refugee issues, right? From refugee resettlement agencies to evangelical groups doing refugee work tied to foreign aid. And we've been sort of messing around for a while with most of these evangelical faith groups actually agree with us on the need to give people safe harbor. The problem is that no one's voting on that. Right? So I think when you think about outreach to faith communities, the question is, it's not enough to agree. How can you get people to be worked up enough about immigration that they would vote for someone that they maybe disagree with on marriage or choice in favor of immigration? And I just think, unfortunately, the reality is people aren't going to do that unless it personally affects them. I think there are very interesting center and right-leaning Latino faith plays at the moment because the polling is insane. Andrea Flores did a presentation that I did a murder board for her for, in May, and I can't remember what the site was, but she had found something that said like 42% of Latino voters, which we all know means like citizens, fear arbitrary arrest and deportation. So I think in faith organizing, there's a lot of cool grassroots stuff to do to get visibility to things. I know that you guys have been doing really cool accompaniment stuff, right, to immigration hearings and so on in San Diego, and I think all of that's really important. I think as a national political and narrative strategy, the question is going to be, how do you deal with sort of the salience of the issue? And if you're doing faith-based outreach, how do you get people to actually vote on it? Or if they're not going to vote on it, what are things like accompanying someone to court or sponsoring a refugee that they could do that are still like meaningful levels of involvement?
Becca and I did not collude on that question, just so you know. Last question.
Are there any women who want to ask questions? I'll take this one. But just like any
Or
women.
my colleague can ask it.
No, to hit me.
All right. So, a little bit of a prelude to the question. That we're from an organization in Philadelphia. It's called the Welcoming Center, where we're doing a lot of the things that you suggested. In fact, we were started in large part by the labor movement 25 years ago. We help immigrants access economic opportunity throughout Greater Philadelphia. So we just started a program with the AFL-CIO and a large South Korean company called Hanwha, which is building ships, civilian right now, in the Philadelphia shipyard. It's a huge operation. They want to hire thousands of people. And we're training immigrants for 3-year union apprenticeships there. And we had a press conference to announce this pilot, and we had one outlet show up. So I was having
You should break that down,
What's
not
that?
here.
Yeah. So last week I was talking to a Philly reporter and sort of having an argument with her to say, we can't get coverage of all of the positive stories that are coming out of our organization because it's not about deportations. It's not about the cruelty of Trump's policies. And I said, we need to cover that. But so long as the framing of immigration in this country remains a binary framework, we only dig deeper into that hole because the other part of the narrative is lost. How do we there are good things happening, and there are, whether it's our organization in Philly or other organizations in other cities, that are propelling the other side of this story, and it's not getting told.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. One of the many things I do is I co-teach the Worker and Immigrants' Rights Advocacy Clinic at Yale Law School, and I actually taught a class with Sarah Stillman last week on how to get the media to cover things. So I would be happy to offline about brainstorming this. I think there are actually a lot of options. I also happen to not believe that press releases really do anything anymore, but that's another hot take. I think a larger issue that you're sort of raising and how I feel about sort of stratcoms and the immigration movement generally is that I think a lot of us since 2016 have been very focused on message testing. And I would argue that having the right message is not our problem. It's that it's getting the message out, right? We're not able to distribute our message. And I also think that philanthropy has significantly cut stratcom support for a lot of organizations, and that distributing messages is really expensive. And I think solving that is really hard. One strategy I've been tooling with that's related to the C4 stuff that we're not talking about is figuring out who's going to get earned media and how do we get them to say stuff. But I think there's a lot of other ways to thread that needle that are probably more kind of bespoke of is it the Philly, is it Trudy Rubin at the Philly Inquirer, and what would appeal to her and who has a relationship with, right? I think it's sort of you gotta hustle the media game the same way that you hustle the other games. And so I'm happy to chat. I do think that a lot of reporters are really interested in covering things about immigration that are not just mass deportation. And I think getting them fodder is important. And it doesn't mean that everything will always be covered. But I think even in a deportation story, no one wants to write the same deportation story over and over again. So if you can give them a new angle, this is a cool new thing that's happening, and in your case, could you tie it to the Hyundai raid, right? Sure. But I I don't know. Like, I'm sorry that people didn't come to the press conference, but I don't actually personally read that as a sign that the media doesn't want to cover non-deportation stories. And I also just think that, like, again, not a dig on your press conference, but like, we're gonna, people like Joe Rogan don't like mass deportation, and he's not gonna wanna have a beer with me, but if we can get him stuff to say and he says it, that's gonna have a really big impact. We're in like a little bit of like a post-New York Times era, I think. When there was like a Pew Research study that only like 36% of Americans actually get their news from like traditional journalism anymore. So I think that's something we have to reckon with also, is just like, how are we sort of operating in this new like digital cultural environment? Yes. Sorry, this is the last one. I just wanted to.
Just on the media, and a happy story. On Thursday, about between 50 and 75 people did the Jericho walk around 26 Federal Plaza, hoping the building would fall down.
Did it?
Didn't, but it did hail on us. And because it hailed on us, there's an article in American Magazine about it. So the word can get out.
These biblical interventions are great news hooks. Okay, obviously there's a lot here, and I realize that I gave like very pithy answers to very complicated questions, but thank you to all for all the work you're doing. Thanks to Kevin for inviting me, and Godspeed.
Thank you, Becca.